If you have people who only care about profit producing your food, then that is very problematic.
The first thing you should do is have compassion for yourself because the system is designed for you to find it hard.
Oh, yeah.
Flavor situates us in time and space.
Yeah.
It must be very confusing for the systems that developed to tell us where we are when the inputs don't match the other inputs.
It's like you're tripping out.
Exactly. Drugs are illegal, but you can trip on Sour Patch Kids all you want. Welcome back to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. On today's episode, my conversation with Rich, Shih. Rich is a scientist, an advocate, a chef, and an author. He's the co-author of the book Koji Alchemy, which talks about the science and art of mold-based fermentation. He's also currently co-hosting a conference called KojiKon, which teaches about the same topic and has guest speakers from all over the world. If you're interested in attending KojiKon, please find a link in the show notes. On this episode, Rich and I talk about his love of food and fermentation, how he grew up in the kitchen watching his mom prepare traditional foods, and how he learned to cook himself. We also talk about the power of fermentation, not only to improve the gut microbiome and human health, but also to preserve food, reducing our reliance on electricity, and to prevent food waste by taking foods that we think of as compost or trash and turning them into delicious, nutritious delights. Please enjoy my conversation with Rich, Shih. Rich, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This is amazing.
It is by far my pleasure. So let's just dive right into it. I want to hear about how you first got excited about food.
It all started when I was a kid and my mom made every meal. She would make 4 or 5 dishes and a soup as demanded by my father. But it was just a sort of journey throughout Taiwan and what she could do with ingredients here in the US. Throughout her childhood, she just learned from her mother and her grandmother and all the people that surrounded them and their family, because in Taiwan, they're multi-generational homes, and it's really great that everybody sort of contributes to the meal and brings things or, stops by with some vegetables or some fruits or some meat that they've picked up, and it's sort of a communal effort. But for the most part, my mom would just go to the grocery store, pick up some things, and have some things that were hanging around the house, and she'd whip up this amazing meal every night. And it just sort of was, assumed that these things would happen. And I don't think I really appreciated it until I sort of adventured into other homes and realized that people would be eating like something like mac and cheese or just like hot dogs and hamburgers or things that were sort of less intensive in the kitchen, more of convenience food and just feeding people with like singular items. So
yeah, that's so awesome. Actually, that made me curious. You mentioned like making what she could with what was available in the US. Can you think of an example of like an ingredient that she had to substitute, or maybe she had to like use 2 things to substitute for one because the thing that she would have used isn't available?
I think in general it was just more so a typical soup in Taiwan would be winter melon soup, which is very much like a honeydew melon, but it tastes like cucumber, and it has virtually no sweetness. It has an interesting texture in terms of sort of the softness. But in cases when obviously, you couldn't necessarily go to the Asian grocery store and get winter melon, my mother would just use cucumber. And cucumber isn't something typically that the Western world cooks necessarily. It's more of a, sort of fresh item that you slice up and, you dip in things or you put in a salad. So at an early age, I got to experience sort of the other side of preparations of the same thing. And I always found that to be most interesting about the way that I think about food now is that I feel like if you're eating something in a certain way, whether it's savory, it could be completely different and sweet on the other side of the world. For example, um, when you think of prunes, you often think of like, oh, like I really need to have some fiber um, and then just sort of enjoy it in a sweet way.
Right, like prunes and chocolate chips or something.
Yeah, or like sticky toffee pudding, right? Something on that nature that's like more leaning totally away from savory. And then I remember visiting this Moroccan shop where this guy was making this pressure cooked like beef and prunes like tagine,
Mm.
and it was the most delicious, like sweet and savory braise that I've ever had before. And I was just like, oh, like why didn't I think of this? Because it's like it makes so much sense.
Yeah. Have you spent any time thinking about five element theory? Like this idea that there are these five different tastes, and if all of them are represented in a meal, that you'll find the meal more satisfying?
Um, I often try to incorporate as many elements of food and flavors and textures as possible. I have never thought like specifically about that, but I often try to figure out how you can get so many things to complement each other without it being overwhelming, but yet still you appreciate the individual components and flavors. So I think I feel like that's the hardest part about cooking is to make something taste better than it is, without going too far.
Yeah, I agree. And I like how you said that. Um, so now you love to cook, which we're sort of tiptoeing towards, as you
Yeah,
mentioned cooking.
sure.
But of course, when you were a kid, maybe cooking was more like a chore, like having to help your mom. So when did that flip for you? When did it go from you have to help mom cook or watch her cook to you love to cook?
Yeah, I think as a child, um, when mother, I think it's just mothers in general, right? They want they want their kid to be nourished, but they don't want them to be bothered by like having to cook. Because I feel like a lot of the attitude when I was growing up was, oh, like you need to spend your time studying because you need to do things to be successful, and you don't need to be cooking because cooking isn't a thing that you should be doing, which I like strongly disagree with at this point. But um, I feel like that was probably some of the reasoning behind why why I didn't necessarily get to cook as much. And being that my mom was such a great cook, I just didn't need to. Between those sort of those sort of motivations, I guess I felt that I just didn't have a need to do it. But then when I went to college, and obviously you just eat sort of crappy cafeteria food. But then once you leave college and you don't, you're making a nominal amount of money, you start to realize how much food costs and how much it costs to eat out, especially if you want to eat something that's really well prepared. And then then I was just like, I can't spend that money and I really like to eat, so I'm gonna have to figure out how to cook. I sort of well, I mean, this is gonna date myself, but I started, looking through cooking magazines, and watching PBS,
That's
so
awesome. Oh, you mean because you weren't Googling? That's why it dates you because
yeah,
you weren't like, I'm going to go to YouTube
yeah.
and I'm going to watch the
There
latest
was
chefs.
there was no YouTube, there was no internet.
Back in the day, way in the
when
way
we had
back,
when we had newspapers.
you would just light a fire in your cave,
Yeah.
close the curtains, and read the newspaper.
Yeah, so yeah, PBS was huge. Julia Child, um, Yan Ken Cook was great. Um, Jacques Pepin, like all of the old school, like all the OGs of like teaching through video when it wasn't really a thing.
Yeah. And at a certain point, did you go back to your mom and ask for some pointers? Or was she like, no, you don't need this?
Um, I think stylistically, I just was more interested in other types of cooking. I didn't I didn't really go back into Asian cooking until like later. I sort of visited more Mediterranean cooking.
So you got into Mediterranean cooking. Do you recall like the first dish that you made that you felt really proud of, or do you recall like what your favorite thing to cook during that period was? If you were gonna like invite some friends over, did you have a go-to? Like Rich is hosting a dinner party tonight. He's gonna make this thing.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that I really enjoyed tomato sauce, and when when I like when I was in college, like embarrassingly enough, I would use jarred sauce, and like it was convenient. And it's like what college kids ate. Um, and then I met my wife, and like her grandparents like grew their own tomatoes, jarred their own tomatoes, like grew their own basil. Like it was ridiculous, and I had never experienced like real gravy until that point, and and that was a revelation for me to understand that somebody could put so much effort into just a sauce, and then it could be at this sort of like epitome of flavor of a season. So when I realized that, I just became sort of obsessed with tomato sauce, and then that sort of went into uh like trying to make shakshuka, which is also, obviously a tomato sauce base. But I thought the beauty of it, because I love a poached egg, was that you could just make this beautiful, super unctuous sauce, and then just like put these little divots, and then just crack some eggs, and then just put the cover on, and just wait a few minutes, and you would have the most perfect poached eggs with like the best umami tomato sauce. And then you could accompany it with any starch you wanted. I mean, I really liked it with couscous, or just some pita that you could just dip in it, or I would just serve it with bread. But I felt like you could sort of encompass like some level of locality and seasonality with all the ingredients of a particular time.
Yeah. I'm so tempted right now to veer off into like the importance of seasonal cooking because I think it's like it's something that when you get really into food, you realize is so important that things taste better in season, that you can go as deep with carrots as you can with wine in terms of like the terroir
Sure.
and like wow, like this was grown in this kind of soil, so it grew this long and it has this kind of crunch and it's like, more or less rigid or whatever and the greens taste like this or that. Um and the average person just like does not know that even if they, eat enough veggies or whatever.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll wander back to that, but I wanna ask you first, when you first got into fermentation, because now that's kind of what you're known for, I would say,
Sure.
and you're passionate about it. So you fell in love with cooking, with fresh ingredients, with knowing where your food came from. How did that transition into a passion for fermenting?
So when I was younger, I was exposed to a lot of ferments and preserves through my mother shopping at the Asian market. They would come in all sorts of jars and cans. Um, Wide variety of flavors, from pickled mustard greens to bamboo shoots that were um, preserved in chili oil, to you know um, these salted plums that were just crazy abrasive and would suck all of the saliva out of your mouth when you ate them. But the fond memory I have of my mom is that sometimes she would just have one in her mouth for like hours. And when I was a kid, she would just give me one, and I would like just put it in my mouth and just spit it out immediately, because I was like, oh my God, that's like such a strong flavor, and it's so salty and unpleasant. But now these days, like I crave that flavor. So that was sort of my exposure palette wise to be able to develop like this understanding of flavors, is through through the Taiwanese cuisine that I grew up with. And I always sort of crave um, that complexity. And also, as I've studied fermentation, it's a matter of like also understanding that complexity of flavor is a complexity of nutrition and nutritional availability. So once I started learning how to cook, um, and then learned more about fermentation, it became to understand that like nutritionally available things through fermentation were super flavorful because that is what we are conditioned to find. And with that understanding, I was like, hey, I need to learn how to make ferments at some point. And there was this instance when I became obsessed with fish sauce just because it's so like umami and it has so much going on, and like especially in, dipping sauces with Thai and Vietnamese food, it's like has this funky way of bringing out flavor in a way that like you can't do in another way. Um so I was obsessed with that, and at one point I decided I would make um fish sauce cured bacon because I was like, "Oh, bacon's umami. I can make it extra umami if I cure it in fish sauce." And um and it was amazing. But I think everybody in my household hated me when I cooked it because it smelled
Yeah.
like fish sauce when you cook it, and it's not pleasant. But at that point, I was on Twitter looking around trying to figure out how to make fish sauce, and there happened to be a chef who had posted that he had just made some, and it was in Cambridge, so it was local to me. And then I sort of just reached out to him and asked him what he was doing, um, and if I could learn from him. And then he invited me into his kitchen, and at the time, he was making all sorts of like crazy ferments. Like he was making like celery kimchi, you know, or he was making mealworm garum, like all of these things like that were sort of becoming apparent in the fine dining world. Um, he was he was like also doing it at the same time. So we got to be good friends because um, as a mechanical engineer by profession slash trade, he knew that I could figure out how to learn processes. So what he had asked me at one point was, "Hey man, like I don't have all this time, so I'm doing this fermentation brunch, and it's showcasing ferments from around the world. Um, I need you to help me learn how to. I need you to make for me koji and ogiri." Um, so obviously koji is the fermented the mold based fermentation of rice to create, all array of uh, different condiments and alcohol and uh, in Japan. So for example, shoyu, miso, mirin, sake, shochu, like all of these things are made by that base of koji. So once I started playing with it, the first thing that really came like my revelation was when I grew this crazy awesome mold called Aspergillus oryzae on rice, like just a specifically cooked way of rice, but essentially just cooked rice and this mold, and you let it incubate for like 2 days. But the realization was because it creates all these enzymes, it has this capability of creating these flavors and aromatics that you would never believe would come from just rice. So you can get these sort of aromatics of mango and coconut and chestnut and honeysuckle and mushrooms just from growing this mold on rice. And through those aromatics, you can imagine the flavors that are created as you sort of leverage these enzymes to break down other substances. So if you think about just soy sauce, right? Soy sauce is soybeans, toasted cracked wheat, salt, and water. And if I asked any person who knows how to cook and is a good cook, they could not make something as delicious as soy sauce. So if you can take sort of that understanding and that application and widen it to other ingredients, you start to unlock these flavors that, sort of anybody in any locale who applies them to a specific ingredient can create a completely new flavor that has never been discovered before. And that's what unlocked it in my brain in order to be able to say, hey, like, I don't have to work so hard to make something delicious because this microorganism is taking these enzymes to break down foodstuffs to make them more digestible for them, but also make them more delicious and nutritious for us. So to have this sort of magical power through this mold is, I feel like it's one of the greatest seasonings that we can use as human beings to create nutrition and delicious food in any context, anywhere. And it's not specific to a locale, a cuisine, region, history. Like, anybody can take this and make their base food better, whether it's a cooking preparation or just an ingredient itself.
Yeah, we met at Georgetown, and we could talk a little bit about that, the microbiome and fermentation and food conference that we were both involved in. I organized, you spoke.
Yeah.
And you, during your talk, showed a few different things. Basically, the suggestion was we all think of shoyu as soy sauce because that's what it would be made from. But you showed a pouch of shoyu made from Parmesan heels
Yeah.
because the idea is, well, if there's protein in something and you ferment it the right way, you can make a flavor-rich umami sauce from it. But I think the average person, again, they think shoyu, soy sauce, soy, it's got to be
Right.
soy. But really, both you and Takashi from Sanjay
Yeah.
spoke about this, that you could make shoyu from, in theory, anything that had the
Absolutely.
right blend of protein and maybe some carbohydrate, like from the wheat that's usually added to it. And that's just such a cool thing to think about, especially when it comes to a shared passion of ours, which is food waste.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what kind of sauces
Sure.
and flavor adders, like, could we be making from what people are now thinking is trash? I mean, who's keeping their Parmesan heel?
Yeah. I mean, typically people throw it in a soup to enhance it to get the last out of it, but obviously it's not as powerful as just applying it to some enzymes that will do the work for you. So,
Right.
I mean, these types of things can happen in all these sorts of contexts. Like, one cool application that my friend Jeremy, who's the co-author of our book, had discovered is that if he took all of his chicken bones and ground them up and add koji to them, he could make this like really crazy bouillon that was super flavorful and just to be able to take, something that would just sort of go into compost or in the trash and convert it into something that's valuable and nutritious and delicious is like, it's just scratching the surface of all the possibilities of what we are throwing out as food or what we are composting. Because like, every last bit of food can be used in this fashion and then held for a long period of time through, these techniques of our ancestors. So it can be accessible to people. And that's why I believe we can feed the whole world through these techniques that we already have.
Right. Yeah. So something that I think maybe is not talked enough about in the health food space is that there are these problems that we broadly identify, but then the solutions that are proposed are very short-sighted and they assume the continuation of our current system. So for example, factory farmed meat is terrible. It's terrible for the environment.
Sure.
It's terrible for people. It's terrible for the animals, of course. So then people that want to improve animal health, people health, and planetary health will often jump right to everyone should be vegan. We shouldn't have animals in our diets. But that supposes the continuation of our current system in which animals are raised horribly
Sure.
and in which they're stripped of their popular at the grocery store meat
Hmm.
and the rest is thrown into a landfill,
Yeah.
becoming waste and being very destructive to the environment. If instead you look back and say, well, how did we used to raise
Right.
animals and what did we used to do? I don't really think Native Americans were just piling up the skins of the,
No.
animals
Yeah.
they hunted and letting them rot and
Right.
greenhouse gases, but they were using them to make
Yeah.
things. So like you mentioning grinding up chicken bones
Yeah.
and making a delicious bouillon, like, wow, okay. So here we have these extraordinarily nutrient-dense foods, and people don't always want to think about this, but many of the nutrients that so many people, especially in the US, are deficient in or scarce
Sure.
in are found in animal foods. So removing animals from our diet doesn't solve the nutrition problem. And whether or not it helps the planetary problem is a little bit moot because it's really about the way that we're doing it is wrong. So yeah, like I would love to just kind of see that conversation change. Same thing with energy usage, right? It's like we're
Sure.
using way too much energy. Well, like you
Yeah.
just mentioned, when you traditionally preserve something, you don't have to refrigerate it necessarily.
Yeah.
Certainly, people 100 plus years ago
Yeah.
were fermenting things because they couldn't
Right.
refrigerate it.
Yeah.
So it's like instead of thinking everyone needs solar panels so they can run their refrigerator and have more refrigeration, and
Yeah.
there's a really big talk about cold storage because it's very important when you're doing fresh food donations, food as medicine programs. There's not a lot of cold storage and it's very expensive to run. Well,
Sure.
shifting that conversation, what could we be preserving, fermenting, getting to people already live cultured, even better for their microbiomes,
Yeah.
and then requiring less energy. So there's this kind of like intersection in the fermentation conversation
Hmm.
where we actually solve these big problems that are currently identified as problems, but whose proposed modern solutions are almost as bad as the problem itself.
Well, I mean, I think it's all a matter of who's in control, right? And who sort of owns this food and like who's making profit and like all those sorts of things. Because if we talk about, sort of um, food independence, then some people start to get scared about, you know, I lose business, right? I lose stockholders and all of these things that sort of cascade. But ultimately, if you think about capitalism versus versus people just feeding people, like capitalism is not interested in feeding people, but that is the driver of what is feeding people. So if you have people who only care about profit producing your food, then that is very problematic because they don't care about your health. They
Right.
just want you to continue to consume. And the way that they do that is they create food that's craveable through these engines that we've talked about in terms of deliciousness, but but it doesn't have the nutrition backing. So like they'll load things up with MSG or salt and sugar, like all of these things that we crave, that we have this understanding of nutrition through just our natural like cravings, because that is what we crave, that we feel that when we have this, it's nutrition when it really is totally void of it.
Right.
So these are the types of things that make it hard to be able to change the system, because the people who control the system aren't actually interested in providing nutrition to people. They're just interested in people as consumers.
Right. Well, and I think also you touched on this very briefly there, like a lot of people who are trying to make a healthy change in their diet, right? So first of all, they think, I'm going to start eating healthy. It's going to taste really boring. And I'm always like, no, wrong,
Yeah,
incorrect.
absolutely wrong.
Rethink that assumption. But yeah, if you think eating healthy means just like plain steamed broccoli and plain steamed chicken, you're not going to really enjoy yourself. The other thing they think is like, there's something wrong with me because I'm craving these big flavors. Like I'm weak or I'm indulgent or I'm gluttonous because I'm craving these like big, powerful flavors. I'm craving sweet. I'm craving salty. I'm craving umami. And they kind of like shame themselves about that. Like they
Yeah.
shouldn't.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you're an animal, and that animal has been wired to
Yeah.
use its senses to
Right.
seek the things that it needs to survive. If
Yeah.
you are desperately craving umami,
Yeah.
it's probably telling you something about your amino acid reserves.
Sure.
They're probably low. But when you eat a Dorito,
Yeah.
you aren't filling them up.
Yeah.
So then you go, I need more, I need more, I need more. And
Yeah.
it becomes this compulsive tick.
Yeah.
But if you were seeking umami in a slow roasted pork shoulder
Sure.
and, some kimchi and all these different complex nutrient dense foods, you might actually find that at the end of that craving, there was satiety.
Yeah.
There was
Yeah.
the feeling of completion because you used your senses the way that they were designed to be
Right.
used, not manipulated by some food scientist in a laboratory whose goal is to make you crazy so you keep coming back for more.
Yeah.
But it's not
Exactly.
the person who's wrong. It's the product that's wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah, but when you've been conditioned your whole life in terms of what's available and what you see in the world and what you eat, like it's those types of things that like are deeply wired in all of our brains. I mean, like I still want to eat like craveable stuff that's like trash because like it's stuck in here, right? Like it's enjoyable, right? To eat crack, like to have food crack, right? It's enjoyable. That's the point. But we have to sort of step back and understand what these foods are. And it's like not to say that you shouldn't indulge in them every now and then, but it's like understand what they are and what their drivers are and make an informed choice. I think a lot of people are not making informed choices because they don't understand like the depth of how polluted our food system is.
Yes. And that's something that I really want to focus on and highlight, actually, because I'm so passionate about that. That people who don't know what's happening are not actually informed enough to make a choice. So they just end up choosing what they think they're supposed to choose because, well, it's in the grocery store.
Yeah.
You see commercials for it.
Yeah.
Your mom bought it for you when you were a kid.
Yeah.
Your friends all eat it.
Yeah.
It's served at schools. It's served in the hospital, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, this food must be fine. So then if I don't feel well and I'm not satisfied at the end of my meal and I'm having these cravings and my
Yeah.
blood sugar is dysregulated,
Yeah.
I must be the problem.
Sure.
I recently had someone ask me, it was a student at Georgetown and I was
Yeah.
speaking there. And she said, I'm trying to make some healthy changes. Like, what's the first thing that I should do? Because I'm finding it really hard.
Sure.
And I was like, the first thing you should do is have compassion for yourself because the system is designed for you to find it hard.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Everything is working exactly as it should. If you find it hard to make healthy choices,
yeah,
that's not you. That's
Yeah.
the world that you are living in. It wants it to be that way.
100%.
But it is so yeah, like people don't know. People aren't buying Doritos for their kids thinking, I want my kid to be desperately craving more Doritos later and to never get what they need from this. I hope they go to sleep at night thinking about Doritos, deeply unsatisfied as their body just yearns for protein that they tasted on their tongue but didn't receive. I hope that little Johnny just hates his life because
Yeah.
he tastes protein but doesn't get protein. No one is thinking that. There's no way. So like chicken or an egg, right? Like, is it like a top-down change? Does the market have to change? Does the education have to change? I mean, I think all of the above, but maybe everyone just needs to, you mentioned food independence.
Yeah.
And I think you also said in your talk, and I totally agree, if everybody grew their own romaine lettuce,
Yeah.
you wouldn't throw away the butt.
Yeah, sure.
You just wouldn't.
Yeah.
Because if you worked for that,
Yeah.
then you look at it and you go, well, surely there's something I could do with this. Like
Yeah.
I know when I bake my own sourdough bread,
Yeah.
I'm not throwing away the stale piece. Like
Yeah.
that's going to be stuffing or something. It's going to go in the freezer. Something will be coming
Yeah.
from that.
Right.
So maybe people do get scared by the term decentralization, but maybe a
Sure.
little bit of decentralizing of some systems,
Yeah.
like the food system.
Sure.
I don't want to make my own couch, okay? But maybe like there are some things I'm like happy to let the market handle for me.
Yeah.
Couches are an easy one because I wouldn't even know where to start.
Sure.
But when it comes to food,
Yeah.
maybe one of the first steps is just getting our hands dirty.
Yeah.
And maybe fermentation is a great place to start because even if you don't have the land or
Yeah.
even a garden plot,
Yeah.
you could still get a jar in your
Yeah.
kitchen and
Yeah.
get to work.
Yeah. Fermentation is one of the easiest things to get into. I mean, for example, I recently taught at Twin Star Orchards in the Hudson Valley, and I decided to teach a class on gochujang. And a lot of people understand gochujang as this like umami spicy paste that's from Korea, and it's in a lot of things and it's super delicious, but a lot of people think that it's like hard to make. But actually it's very simple because um, all the ingredients are, if you go to like a Korean market or obviously online, like they're all the ingredients are there. Like you get the fermented soybean paste, powder. It's called meiju, and then you get some goju, which is chilies, and salt, water, and that's it.
All the commercial ones have wheat flour. Are you saying I can make a gluten-free gochujang?
I think you have to check the soybean powder
Mm.
because sometimes they do have wheat, but oh yeah, and you also need rice syrup, which is easy to get as well. Um, so what was interesting is that I had a few Korean Americans in my class, and they were just like, I didn't realize how easy it was to make. Like my grandmother used to make this, and now I feel empowered to make it myself because it's so easy. And I was like, yeah, yes, like fermentation is easy because if you think about how, like we were talking about efficient energy usage, right? Like if you were back in the day, like you had to be really efficient about how you used your energy and how much reserve sort of energy through food you had. Because if you didn't balance those things, you would die. So it only makes sense that fermentation would be easy because you can't expend a lot of energy to create nutrition so you can survive, right? So we leveraged microbial behavior to do the digestion and nutrition creating for us. And of course, like it happened by chance at times to be able to create these ferments, but to have that little amount of energy and to employ like, I don't know, whatever, trillions of like little microbes to do their thing, like it was pretty ingenious because you could just go to these different pots throughout the winter or whenever there was a lack of harvest, and you would just continue to eat through these pots and like until you got to the point when you would have some way to produce food. And if it took a lot of energy to make ferments or to preserve food, then it would not work at all.
Right. Because the whole point is to save energy
Yeah.
and make it more digestible and make it last to times that it wouldn't normally be around. I mean, I have friends who are from Russia, and of course, they ferment. If it's part of their culture, is
Yeah.
that they grow food and they preserve it because,
Yeah.
of course, you had to. Of course, you just would.
Right.
It's going to get very cold. There won't be anything
Yeah.
growing,
Yeah.
and you're going to want cabbage later.
Yeah.
So you learn to ferment it. I also think that, you mentioned like people not knowing how easy it is to make ferments, but I also think that some people think that they wouldn't like the taste, not knowing that the flavors that our American condiments mimic come from
Yeah.
lactofermentation.
Yeah.
Like every
Yeah.
condiment has vinegar in it,
Yeah. Absolutely.
and vinegar is a ferment.
Yeah.
So that tang,
Mhm.
it tastes like a preserved product,
Yeah.
It's just ultra processed
Yeah.
and full of sugar and salt and
Exactly.
vinegar. So one time I made a fermented ketchup.
Hmm.
It was so good.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not trying to hate on regular old American ketchup because I actually
Sure.
do enjoy that.
Of course.
But these flavors, like if someone thinks, oh, like I don't even think I would like ferments, maybe they're too funky. I think if you've had mustard, ketchup,
Sure.
relish, sauerkraut, I don't know.
Sourdough.
Yeah, sourdough bread. Any of these things, hot sauce, right? A
Yeah.
lot of hot sauces are very vinegar forward.
Yeah.
If you like any of those flavors, there's a ferment for you because that
Yeah.
tang and
Yeah.
that spice, that's what ferments bring.
Yeah. But it's also that like key to your brain, like, oh, something's going on here, right? That, it's been pre-digested. Like these are all indicators that there's nutrition there.
Yeah. Also at that workshop, event, conference that you and I were both at Georgetown, this woman, Ariel Johnson, spoke about flavor. And she
Yeah.
had this line that I wrote down in the moment because it was so good.
Yeah.
I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but it was something like flavor situates us in time and space. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
we know where we are and
Yeah.
what's going on
Yeah.
based on what we taste. And thinking about us as human animals
Sure.
and picturing how we would have learned about the world around us, of course, flavor is teaching us so much. So, I'm picturing like a modern human sitting in a movie theater wearing 3D glasses, eating Sour Patch Kids
Yeah.
and buttered popcorn. And how confusing. And then we wonder why we have so many illnesses of the nervous system. It's like, what is happening out there? Oh my God. You're on a spaceship and you're just, I don't know, drinking salt.
Yeah.
It must be very confusing
Yeah.
for
Sure.
the systems that developed to tell us where we are
Yeah.
when the inputs
Yeah.
don't match
Yeah.
the other
It's
inputs.
like you're tripping out.
Exactly. We're just, drugs are illegal, but you can trip on Sour Patch Kids all you want. It's totally fine. Go right ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think like flavor, coming back to this piece about like what ferments offer people
Yeah.
is it's this window into what flavor is actually doing, the function of flavor.
Yeah.
Ferments teach the function of flavor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Got it.
And like we don't have rumens, cows and goats and sheep.
Yeah. Yeah.
They have these incredible onboard biodigesters. So they have,
Yeah.
they eat salad all day
Yeah.
and they just ferment it. But as humans, we kind of evolved to have external
Yeah.
biodigesters
Right.
because we ferment. You don't see a lot of cows making their own kimchi, but they don't have to. If you
Yeah.
do, I'd like to have that cow on the podcast. But most cows are making their onboard ferments,
Yeah.
but we don't have that option.
But if we fed cows kimchi, would that be a better tasting beef?
I'm willing to try it. I mean, so the interesting thing is that, bacteria have horizontal genetic transfer. So if you put the bacteria from the kimchi into the cow's rumen, and then the rumen like learned something from that, it might change.
Yeah.
Maybe you have a very spicy cow after that. It could be interesting.
Yeah.
We could ask some people to give it a shot.
Yeah.
If
I've always wanted to feed raise a pig on just like koji.
Yeah. Well, have you ever had like Iberico?
Yeah.
Yeah, like
yeah.
it is so interesting how if
Yeah.
you raise an animal on one thing, you can really kind of taste
Yeah,
that
yeah.
thing in their meat.
Yeah.
Raising a pig on koji. But just koji or like koji inoculated everything?
Yeah.
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 All of the above.
Koji inoculated things.
Yeah. He's going to be having a miso soup and
Be a very delicious pig, I think.
yeah. Well, I hope you get a chance to do that. Definitely let me know. And then you can make some fish sauce bacon at the very end. It'll just be the most
Oh my
umami
God.
pig to ever have existed. Okay. I want to ask you, you recently went to Japan
Yes.
and you were, even though many people here would think that you already are an expert on koji, you were immersed in
Yeah.
an environment of learning.
Yeah.
So talk to me about what you learned when you were in Japan.
So I had the honor of being sort of like a pseudo apprentice for 3 days at my friend's small craft miso brewery. It's called Gomi Shoyu. He doesn't make shoyu anymore, but he makes awesome miso. And through my friend Hiraku-san, he introduced me to Gomi-san, and he just was like, "Hey, come for like 3 days and learn how to make koji. We'll learn how to make koji the way we make it." And it was one of the most beautiful experiences I've had in my life because I had studied it and practiced it myself, never on that scale, and had this fundamental understanding of how to do it. Um, in all sorts of production cases, whether it be small or large batch, but to actually have my hands in it and to like talk to the guys who are making it every day and like understanding how they do it pretty much all through feel was like super cool, and leveraging certain parts of technology that obviously like with scale makes sense, but overall their process is fairly straightforward in terms of um the growth and the cooling. It's all done without any sort of extras. I mean, they do have some supplemental heating and some supplemental cooling, but for the most part, um, it's just in a big room, and they're growing mold beautifully on rice. And and it's like interesting in terms of how they transfer large masses. Typically, small producers will have different floors where they start with the grain where it's cooked, and then it gets dropped down a level, so it starts its first stage of growth, and then it drops down another level for like the final stage of growth. So it's a really simple process, but it takes a lot of sort of knowledge and understanding through practice to be able to get it just right, and to be able to just be a part of this sort of generational learning and understanding was really cool. Like it's not I mean, it's like I don't know how to describe it. It's like you're learning a craft um of, you know, of like ancient times. And yes, it has changed in terms of technology in different ways, but ultimately it hasn't changed. And to understand how to efficiently grow koji on rice, like it's such a sort of simple idea and simple concept, but it takes so much in terms of understanding just to do it right, through doing it so many times. It just becomes sort of like part of you.
Yeah. So, as a microbiome enthusiast and educator, I do a lot of re educating people about the word bacteria, right? Because our culture has come
Sure.
to fear bacteria. They're bad. You want to kill them, sterilize. Same
Yeah.
thing with viruses. We're now learning that you can actually harness viruses for a lot of good, and that there are viruses kind of gardening our microbiomes, so to
Sure.
speak.
Yeah.
Talk to me about the word mold, because so many people, myself included, have so
Yeah.
many
Yeah.
negative associations
Yeah.
with the word mold,
Yeah.
and yet they love miso and they love tamari and, maybe they love sake, and they're not realizing that sometimes the beneficial
Sure.
version of something can actually crowd out the more pathogenic versions of it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and also that these cultures have a long history of living in harmony with
Sure.
humans. So talk to me about the joys and the challenges of educating people about the benefits of mold.
I think what I usually start with um to help people feel comfortable about using a mold in their food is that I'll often talk about sourdough starters, right? Because if you think about what you do with a sourdough starter, um, in sort of like food safety sense, it's it's a no-no, right? You just take flour and water, you stir it up, you sit it on your counter, and you wait until it starts bubbling and doing its thing. And that is very much accepted in the Western world, right? But if you happen to see some mold growing on something, like in the Western world, it's like, oh, it's bad. We got to throw it out. But everywhere like in Asia, like when you see mold growing on something that's been sitting outside because it was purposely put there to like as a starter, like not any different from a wheat sourdough starter, like it's totally okay. So I think a lot of it is just cultural understanding of what is good and bad, and there's also like the context of like, you know, imperialism, right? Like this way is better than the other way. And that way is disgusting and this way is not disgusting. It's like we can talk about how people who are proper use utensils, but if you're using your hands to eat, like, and pulling apart food and like enjoying the the texture and understanding the temperature of the food and like how delicate it is to like enjoy it with your hands, like that's another thing, right? But is it gross and disgusting? Absolutely not. So these are the types of things that like people have been ingrained in their heads in terms of what something is. And so I often say like you are happy to make a sourdough starter or you are happy to culture some cream on your counter or make yogurt, but yet if I if you cook some steamed rice and you put a single cell or a singularly isolated mold that's known for good and growing on it in a clean environment that nothing else will grow on it, like you should feel perfectly safe that you're doing what you should do with a food mold.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is funny how we have these different contexts and also like, you mentioned imperialism, but also just like the mindset that many cultures, whatever becomes the norm amongst the most affluent becomes
Hmm.
coveted.
Sure.
And then the sort of underclasses of people will really, really, really want to do that thing, even though that thing actually isn't healthy at all.
Absolutely.
Like eating sugar, for
Yeah.
example, it's like
Yeah.
it used to be a thing that only the very richest people could possibly do,
Yeah.
and now it's like everyone's eating it all the time, and it's incredibly destructive, so I was
Or
just
just like having meat being the biggest portion on your plate
right,
because that was a sign of wealth.
exactly, yeah, I met a girl who said that, she had grown up I forget where it was somewhere in Africa, and she said that as a kid, they did not eat legumes because that was, like,
Poor
the
people
poor
food.
people
Yeah, yeah,
food,
yeah.
yeah, and then she realized that she loved legumes and that they were delicious and nutritious and that it was just like a cultural class bias that
Yeah.
because her family was higher class, they, of course, ate lots of meat
Yeah.
and no legumes, so learning how to work legumes back into her diet and to not think of it as, like, poor people food, but just as something delicious and nourishing that happens to be
Exactly.
accessible. It's actually like, why I mean, I guess they're just abundant, but I'm like, legumes are so cool. How come they've never gotten their day in the sun? Like, why aren't legumes like so fancy that only the rich people eat them? Like one day, it's like hummus is going to be like no one can have it except the very top. Well, I guess hummus kind of has that vibe to
Yeah, I
it,
feel
but
like
it's so cheap to make.
yeah, but I feel like hummus is having its day or had its day of like, hey, I'm gonna get some hummus
Right.
and
It's like
for
bougie.
yeah, that's like or like all of these different like legumes that people use or flavors. I don't know. It's like it's interesting what cycles through.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's just like important to realize that social norms change, but certain things stand the test of time, like mold-based fermentation.
Sure.
For example, if it works, then it
Yeah.
sticks around and
Yeah.
other things fall by the wayside.
Yeah.
Okay, so you do a lot of education.
Sure.
You teach people, you do workshops, and you also are part of a thing called KojiKon.
Yeah.
And you also wrote a book, which you referenced. So, can you tell us a little bit about KojiKon and about your book?
So KojiKon was born of the pandemic. We originally had this idea that we would um, have an in-person event where speakers with Koji knowledge would teach, and we would just have a good time, right? People would come and speak, and people would learn. But then we decided to shift gears because of the pandemic, and my friend Jen Rothman, super resourceful lady and like friend. she was just like, I've never done an online conference before. Let's just do it. We thought we'd get like 100 people, and we're just like, that'd be fine. Um, we tiered the pricing so we could make it accessible to as many people as possible. And when we and in our first KojiKon, we had 30 presenters who were part of it. But when we released tickets, uh, we had this sort of like overflow of interest, and we ended up with over 1,000 attendees in
Wow.
the first year.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, yeah. So it was unbelievable in terms of interest and people wanting to learn more, but also to be able to make people aware of who the experts are, because when I was learning about it, several years ago, like it only existed in like certain pockets of people and literature and like obscure like science papers. So it wasn't really cohesive in terms of general knowledge, understanding, and experimentation um, and basics. So the idea was to create these resources to make it more accessible. And that's why we also wrote the book, uh, to capture the time that we had a series of experts who could contribute to the larger forum so people could have a resource and be able to build off that. Because in the education space, when we were sharing online in different ways, we would continually get the same questions over and over again. It only made sense to provide a like central resource.
Yeah, that's awesome, and it's a beautiful book. I mean,
Thanks.
the cover especially is just very stunning,
Yeah.
and a very lovely book. I have it in my kitchen, and I have it near my Koji friend,
Yeah.
who's currently sleeping, but, lying in wait. Okay. You talk a lot, about community,
Sure.
and I think community is a great word, much like the word culture. It has
Sure.
these human applications, it has fermentation applications, it has all kinds of uses. So I would love to hear from you about the word community and what it means to you.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I first started learning about cooking and making food, like my entry to anybody's kitchen was genuine interest. Like, um, whether I'd ask, somebody's aunt how they made a certain dish or a sauce, or asked a chef how they cooked a particular piece of meat, or uh, was aging, a duck, or, you know, how they broke down a fish. It was one of these things that people who cook are like really passionate and intense in terms of their understanding and research that I don't think a lot of people appreciate, especially with chefs, because they do it because they like absolutely love it, um, because they don't really get paid enough to do what they do. And they're always willing to share, because the idea is when you cook as a chef, you are providing people with nutrition. So it's always based on sharing. So, like, what was interesting to me is that I would always be welcome. Um, whether, sometimes it was harder than other times depending on the personality, but, just to bring something that I had made, or um, ask a like very specific question about a preparation because I had actually tried it and failed. Like these are the types of things that I felt really helped with my knowledge and sort of like understanding what community meant, because once I was part of, you know, the kitchen crew, or, a group of fermenters, it was just like we had this bond on like, what are you working on today? Like, what does this taste like? What's wrong with this? Or like, how can I tweak this? Or, like, you have these ideas that um, are born of your own experiences, but you'll never have like all the ideas because there's somebody with a completely different experience that will be like, hey, have you tried this? And being able to have that community that supports you in your understanding and growth is like one of the things that has literally changed my life, because I don't feel that I've ever had that in the context of learning in such a strong way. Um, and that's why I continue to try to interconnect people who have these understandings, because like I feel like, okay, it's one thing if I can talk to people and understand something for myself, but what does that mean for me? Because like it only goes so far, right? But if I can sort of understand these things and convey them to other people and share them, then they blossom into all these other things that happen, right? So I often think about like uh, what I'm doing is like uh, essentially helping like koji like spread, um, and not in just like the ideas of nutrition or or food or development. It's just like there's this interconnectivity of people and developing relationships that help each other, that go beyond just fermenting food or growing koji. It's just like this thing that continues to build this sort of like baseline helpfulness of others. And like it just so happens it's like started by like a genuine interest in like making delicious food and nutritious food.
Yeah. And I think like you had a unique experience of watching your mom cook. But for a lot of us growing up in the
Sure.
US,
Yeah.
especially like maybe multiple generations removed from
Yeah.
that kind of cooking environment,
Yeah.
there's a need to rebuild that. And the same way that many people have depleted gut microbiomes because they haven't eaten fiber or fermented
Sure.
foods in 100 years, there's also a depletion of that support
Hmm.
system, that inherited wisdom of how to cook, how to ferment,
Yeah.
how to prepare food, how to feed yourself. So I really feel like the work that you're doing is recreating what might have come traditionally from the family
Sure.
or from the
Yeah. Yeah.
town or the village.
Yeah.
Now that community is being pieced together by the people who have the tools, have the knowledge, and are willing to share because, the same way that some person might need a probiotic
Hmm.
because they've never had a beneficial bacteria,
Yeah.
people need books
Yeah.
on how to ferment. They need workshops because it wasn't just given to them by their grandma. So I just think it's so awesome, and I think it's
Yeah.
so
I
important.
appreciate that. I mean,
It's
I just feel good about helping people, and I want to figure out how to make other people feel the way that I feel about supporting others, because I don't know, it's just if I if I wasn't supported by others to get to where I am in terms of my understanding and all the things that I've been gifted, like I I don't know what I would do. So having been gifted these things, I want other people to have that um empowerment to do it themselves. So I don't know. I always feel like, there's this focus on people, like a certain person who is popular for whatever reason in terms of their talents. I've never understood, like, I get it, but I don't really get it, because it's like focus on like what you're passionate about and the people who are doing that can help you get better, and then you yourself can improve, and it doesn't have to do with a specific person that you admire. It has to do with like this sort of wholeness.
Yeah. It's sort of like how you don't have to make shoyu from soybeans.
Yeah.
Soybeans are very famous and popular,
Yeah.
but potentially anything that has the right building blocks can be inoculated and produce
Yeah.
something delicious the same way that millions of people, they might not be, I don't know, Beyonce or whatever,
Yeah.
but if you give them knowledge and
Sure.
music and good
Yeah.
food,
Yeah.
they have unlimited human potential. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, I love that.
Cool.
That's beautiful. Well, Rich, I really want to thank you for traveling down here just to see me. Just kidding. I know you have multiple reasons to be here, but I deeply appreciate you for coming and joining us and for sharing about everything that you do and for the work that you do, because it's so cool. And you're helping a lot of people, myself included, get less mold averse, more cultured, and more aware of how flavors function. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. I'm happy to do it. And if anybody needs help with mold-based fermentation or any fermentation or just wants to make some crazy delicious flavors, I'm here. So
Awesome. And
come find me.
We will send them your way.
Absolutely. I'm ready.
Thank you once again for listening to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. For more information on me, Marian, please visit my website at marianflaxman.com. For more information on my guest, Rich Shih, or for more information on his event, KojiKon, please find the links in the show notes. As a reminder, this podcast is not affiliated with my work at Cornell University Center for Precision Nutrition and Health. This episode was produced by Brain Trust Productions and sponsored by Informed Solutions Consulting. Thank you so much as always for listening, and we will see you next time.